Greetings, everybody. My name is Matic Arundel. I am the Shrike Herald Extraordinaire, given that title by the Kingdom of Callantyr, following my tenure as the Gold Falcon Principal Herald there. I am currently serving in the role of Cornelian Herald of AEthelmearc, which is the deputy to Garnet. Garnet is the deputy Kingdom Herald for submissions and commenting. And by an odd twist of fate, I am also currently serving as the acting Garnet Herald. I'm going to be talking for about the next hour and 15 minutes about heraldic consultations as it relates to names. This is a class that I originally offered at AEthelmearc AEcademy and plan to offer in the future, both at AEthelmearc AEcademy and AEthelmearc Heralds and Scribes. But given that we are currently not having events scheduled based on things going on in the United States right now, I am putting this out online so that folks can access the materials in lieu of attending any of those Academy events. Now, I will preface this by saying that I am not by nature a names herald, also known as an onomast. I am familiar with the various rules and regulations in the College of Heralds by virtue of the fact that I have been an SCA herald for well over 35 years at this point, and I've been a commenting herald. I've been a submissions deputy on multiple occasions. I've been a principal herald. So I am familiar with how it all works. What I will tell you is that I know very little about most of the languages that the SCA uses for their various name submissions. And so I will not be talking a whole lot about specific naming practices by culture or country. I will instead be talking mostly about the procedures for ensuring that you, as the consulting herald, can assist your client in developing a name that stands a reasonable chance of getting registered by the SCA College of Arms. So the four things that we are going to be talking about today, one is first contact with a client. And I will tell you that you will see clients from across the spectrum of, hi, I'm new to the SCA and I have no idea what I'm doing, all the way up to, I've been in the SCA for 30 years. I've been using this name since I started. I've been given some major award and I really thought I should have a registered name. You also run into clients, whether you're actively consulting at the time or not. There are people who know that because you are a herald, they will feel free to come up to you at pretty much any time and start asking you questions about name submissions. And regardless, all of those count as part of your first contact. We're going to look at a couple of online resources that are available to assist you with finding a name that is acceptable to your client. We're also going to look at where you can locate certain hard copy resources that are also available. I've been doing this since before online was available, so hard copy resources are things I'm a little bit more familiar with. And then we're going to look at how you can check for conflict and make sure that your client's selected name stands a reasonable chance of making it through the commenting process and becoming a registered name. So first of all, as I said, first contact, you might be running a consult table, you might be working the heraldry tent at Penzic, but you also might just be recognized. And when people come up to you to start asking you about heraldic registration, they are going to be from across the spectrum of knowledge and information. Now, this can be a good or bad thing. I mean, it's good if your client has some familiarity with the processes, but it's also possible that if you're not the first person they've talked to about it, that they've heard a lot of things from other people that may or may not in fact be true. So first contact is very important because that's where we set the expectations with the client. And I'm going to start out by saying if you have a client who has little to no idea of what it is that they're looking for specifically, you really want to start out asking some questions, some very basic questions. Other questions might be more appropriate if your client does have some kind of clue as to what they're looking for, but you need to get to know them a little better in order to assist them in fine-tuning their desires or expectations. So ask questions. Ask them if they have a time period in history that they are particularly interested in. There is a big difference in language across the centuries. There's also a big difference in naming practices. I mean, we stretch from before the Roman Empire all the way up through the reign of Queen Elizabeth in England. The naming practices across that 1,000-year window changed immensely. I mean, think about the changes that we've had in the modern era just in the last 20 or 30 years, and multiply that by 50. So get an idea of what time period your client is interested in. The next thing that you might want to ask them about is if they have a culture or a country that they may want to focus on. Some clients like to emulate specific cultures. A very popular one, medieval Japan. Another popular one is early Scandinavian, from 10th century Norse Viking all the way to the Viking Rus cultures. There's some people that are interested in pursuing Germanic, Swiss, Landsknecht, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, the Iberian Peninsula, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these are going to have slightly different naming practices. There are some basics that stretch across pretty much all cultures in our time period, but there are enough differences that getting familiar with what type of culture or nationality they want to emulate will help significantly. Last but not least, there is the language question. There are some people out there that while they may affect a persona from a particular culture, they may prefer to keep all of their registrations, all of their SCA business in their native language. Now, it used to be we had a rule called lingua anglica, which was that anything could be translated into English, regardless of what the original language was for the name. That has since been changed to a rule called lingua societas, which allows people to translate the names into a language spoken in the country in which they're currently residing. So language may not be as important for somebody exercising the lingua societas option, but there are some more hardcore Scadians that, if they have a Spanish persona, they want a purely Spanish name. If they have an ancient Roman persona, they may want a very formal name in the Latin practice. So understanding the druthers of your customer right from the start is very, very important. If you are asking these questions of your client, they're like, well, I don't know. No, there's no culture that I really focus on. I'm just I'm generic Scadian. Find out if there's any particular type of clothing they like to wear. There are people out there that they just really get off on wearing, fine Elizabethan clothing or Italian Renaissance, or people who are much more into comfortable clothing and maybe opting for, Byzantine style Scandinavian apron dresses or basic tea tunics, something more generic. But if they have a particular style of clothing they like to wear, they might be able to build a persona story around the culture or country of that type of clothing. This goes for other items as well. Ask them what kind of food they like to eat, what kind of music they like to listen to, if they've ever been particularly interested in any topic in school, in history or social studies class. Did any particular topic really strike their fancy? And in that way, you can kind of get a feel for if we're looking for a detailed period correct name, or you are going to run into clients who are just like, no, I just want to be, John the Smith, and nice generic native language given name, surname, and move on from there. But that first contact is very, very important for understanding what your client wants. Now, it's also a very, very important time for setting your client's expectations. When I first got into the SCA, I was interested in affecting a Germanic persona, but at the same time, I had also just got done reading a series of books that dealt with mythical Welsh royal family, and I really liked the first name of one of the Welsh princes in those stories, Madoc. Now, as you know from my introduction, I did in fact choose the name Madoc, but originally I wanted to, a brand new Scadian, real hyped on the whole rattan sword fighting thing. I wanted to be Madoc the Blood Lover, but I wanted Blood Lover to be in German because my family heritage in the real world is Germanic. And so I was calling myself Madoc der Blutlandsticker for about a year before I actually sat down with the Herald to find out what I could register. This is important for a couple of different reasons, but that first bullet there, language mixes. Regardless of whether your client wants a very detailed, very correct period name, or if they just want generic Scadian, there are certain languages that we cannot put together in a name because they never appeared together in a name in our time periods. So SCA, the Standards for Evaluation of Names in Armoury, is the gospel as it pertains to the requirements for submitting names and Armoury. Has an Appendix C which lists all of the major and minor language groups that are commonly used in SCA names and which languages you can blend in order to build a proper SCA name. So check out Appendix C. You probably want to be familiar with it before you start consulting. But even if you're not, having a printed copy of Appendix C handy if you're doing formal consultations will help out quite a bit. Also, we talked about the temporal spread. We talked about the millennia that exist in the period that the SCA covers, and how the name practices changed across those centuries. The SCA does have a limit on the time period of the number of years of spread in a time period that you can have between elements of the name. And in general, it's a 500-year spread. So if you find a given name in 1200 AD and a surname in 1600 AD, they're less than 500 years apart as long as the language mix is okay. The temporal spread is okay. When you start getting into certain language mixes or you start getting into certain allowances, exceptions from standard naming practices, that temporal spread drops to about a 300-year span, and the College of Arms is much more strict on how far apart the names can be time-wise. Next is minimal documentation. I have had a number of clients, some very recently, who have provided me with a submission sheet where under documentation it says see attached and there's nothing attached. I've had recent clients who have said that their name documentation was a website and they just post the URL without giving me any of the justification for the name from that website, in which case I have to run it down in order to find out if the documentation is legitimate. There are some sources that we cannot use in SCA naming practices. We'll talk about those later. There are some sources that we can use with impunity, meaning all we have to do is cite them. We don't actually have to provide any printed out copies. But most name documentation, if it's found from a reputable source, is going to require a transcription of the information from the source onto the submission form in order to justify the spelling, the meaning of the name, the position, whether it's a given name or a surname, or a by name of some kind. There does have to be minimal documentation justifying each name element. Holding names. This is something I talk with new clients about all the time. And when I present my class on doing consultation for Armoury, I always stress with the client that it is a requirement that you have a registered SCA name in order to have registered SCA Armoury. Now, the name does not have to be registered before you submit the Armoury. You can submit the name at the same time, but the name is what everything is cataloged against in the database. So sometimes we have Armoury that is perfectly acceptable, no conflict, and can be registered immediately, but the name is not acceptable for whatever reason. And when that happens, the College of Arms will create what's called a holding name, and that's a temporary name, which is generally your mundane first name coupled with your local group. So in my case, Christopher of Hunter's Home. And they will use that holding name as a placeholder in the names database so they can register your Armoury. Now, the thing with the holding names, and this is what you need to tell the clients about, is it's a temporary name. If you are issued a holding name, you are allowed to submit a new name for registration without having to pay the cost of changing the name. So it's basically a free spot on the bingo board. But I also stress when we get to filling out the forms that a holding name can only be created if the client gives permission for it to happen. So if the client checks the little box that says no holding names, if your name is no good, but your Armoury is, both of them are going to get kicked back to you. And the client needs to understand that going into this process. There are also major versus minor changes. And when we get to the forms, we'll talk about the opt-in, opt-out boxes where the client will allow certain changes without having to come back to the client for permission. Minor changes is, if you have to change the spelling, even by a single letter, that is a minor change. Major changes, changing the article, like John the Smith to John A. Smith, is actually considered a major change because it changes an entire word. Changing Robert to Robin would be a major change. Changing provincial French to Latin Vulgate would be a major change. The client gets to elect whether they want a major changes or minor changes leading up to registration. And what it's important to explain to the client is that if you check the box saying, I do not allow minor changes, if I have to change even one letter to make the name registerable, it gets kicked back. If I leave that box unchecked, even though you've given me permission to make the change, I'm still going to contact the client if I have to make the change. So if I have to change the spelling of Ingen from I-N-G-E-N to I-N-G-H-E-A-N, I'm going to contact the client. I'm going to go, hey, the spelling doesn't work for the time period. Your surname is from 1000 AD. The spelling of your article is from 1600 AD. That's more than a 500-year spread. I can change the spelling to this and fix the problem. Even though you've given me permission ahead of time to make that change, I'm still going to contact you before I send that up to Laurel for possible registration. Same thing with major changes. If you uncheck the box that says major change, you're not submitting John the Smith and winding up with James the Bishop, even though you've given me permission to do that. Any major change I make, I'm still going to come back to you ahead of time before pushing it further along in the submissions change. So when I'm counseling clients on that, what I generally tell them is, think about what's most important in your name and decide if a change to that element would be permissible without your knowledge. Because theoretically, you're giving me permission if you leave the box unchecked. So if John the Smith versus John A. Smith isn't that important to me, leave the boxes unchecked. If I want Nicholas the practitioner, and I want practitioner spelled with a C instead of a T, and that is absolutely the most important thing to me, by God, check those boxes. Don't allow the change. It'll come back to you, but at least you will have avoided the hassle of having to go through a name change later on. When we talk about names, every SCA name has to have two elements. So you can't be Cher, you can't be Prince. You have to have a given name and a by name. And the by name can be a surname, it can be any type of by name, and these are the most common ones that we have here in the SCA. The first one is locative. Locative by names are where are you from. So if I were Matic of Hunter's Home is a locative by name. Very, very common in some parts of our period by virtue of the fact that people didn't move around a lot. So you generally lived most of your life within the same general area that you were born in. And so it was relatively easy to identify you by your place of residence. Occupational by names, Smith, Schumacher, Thatcher. All of these are job descriptions that came to identify individuals. So if you were John the Miller versus John the Thatcher, or John Miller versus John Thatcher, drop the article entirely, telling two Johns apart on the basis of what each of them did for a living was actually also very common in most of the time periods that the SCA covers. And most occupations, even if I can't find an occupation that was turned into a name or actually used as a name and period, the very fact that I can document an occupation as existing and I can document the use of occupational by names means that most of the occupations that I can think of would be permissible for registration in the SCA. Now, there are some that are not permitted because of certain rules in the administrative handbook. Any occupational by name that alludes to, say, mystical powers or divine provenance is probably going to be disallowed. You know, if I claim to be Jehovah's son, that's probably going to get kicked back simply because I'm essentially claiming to be the son of God. But most occupational bynames are acceptable. Descriptive bynames are bynames that give some aspect of your physical appearance as a way to distinguish you. For instance, Longshanks, which was a nickname given to one of the King Henrys of England. Longshanks literally means one with long legs. Tall, short, fat. Um, a redheaded person might be known as John the Ginger, or if you have a prominent nose or scraggly hair, or you're missing a leg. There is generally a descriptive of some aspect of the personal appearance that can be used as a byname. Relationship bynames. The most common form of relationship byname is what's called the patronymic, and that is basically a byname that means son of a person or daughter of a person, male person. A matronymic would be the son or daughter of a female person. So a patronymic, for example, the last name in America, Johnson, literally translates to son of John. That would be considered a patronymic byname. And there are a number of different forms that patronymics can take. They can take the form of the son of your father's first name. They can also take the form of the son of your father's occupation. So if your father was John the Thatcher, you could theoretically be John Thatcher's son, as a relationship byname. Dictus, cognamento, and alias. For lack of a better term, they're not very common. Historically, they're not very common in the SCA. There is some difficulty in documenting certain ones, but basically finding patterns for a variety of cultures and time periods is relatively difficult. But a cognamento or alias, that would be when you have a nickname, is basically the way of putting it. And one example of that I can give, I knew a gentleman down in Meridies who had been going by the name Theoden for most of his SCA life. And he went to register his name, and he found out that Theoden was not actually a registerable first name. So he chose a different first name and a byname that went along with it, and tacked on called Theoden onto his name. So when he's called into court, he's called in as Sir, first name, byname, called Theoden. Their Majesties would have words with you, so on and so forth. So the thing with the cognamento, dictus alias, generally speaking, they're probably not registered, but a lot of people will use them as their everyday name among people that they know in the SCA. Inherited names is another issue in the SCA. Generally, an inherited name is going to be one of the other types of byname, locative, occupational, descriptive, or relationship. But an inherited name is, for example, my last name is Miller. My father's last name was Miller. My grandfather's last name was Miller, and so on and so forth back about 11 generations. We haven't had a person in those 11 generations that has worked as a miller, a person who mills grain, for centuries. 11 generations of nobody being a miller. But the last prominent ancestor, whatever his name was, Martin the Miller, the term miller ended up becoming an inherited byname. So even though his son was not working as a mill worker, his son was called Miller instead of Martinson. And that name continued to be inherited. It is a very modern concept, highly unusual in most of our time periods and most of our countries and cultures for a wife to take the husband's by name on marriage, for children to take the father's by name from birth. Much more likely that those wives or children would have been known by one of those other types of by name. So the reason dictus and inherited are in italics is because they are extremely rare and not a very high chance of making it through the registration process. Now, when we talk about how to find names, we have a number of resources available. And I actually started life as a herald about 35 years ago. And we didn't have the internet back then. Everything was done through hard copy. We did have interlibrary loan, which was good. So in the last roughly 30 years, the increase in the amount of information that is available to us over the web has been an absolute godsend for SCA heralds. And the first resource that I like to talk about is, oh, cannot open that file. Okay, the first resource that I like to talk about is the actual SCA Heralds website, heraldry.sca.org. There are a number of resources that are linked to out of that particular web page, and unfortunately, I can't click through to it to show you actively, but there are articles on Armoury, articles on naming practices, actual roles and censuses, and historical documents that have been either added to the site or linked to from the site from a number of different countries and cultures. And you can see on the screenshot here, name sources by culture and type. Asia, Byzantium, Eastern Europe, England, France, Germany, so on and so forth, all different types of countries and cultures that are identified there. And when you click through, there are articles, there are actual historical documents that are linked out to. There are also a number of articles written by SCA members or by other historical societies, such as the Academy of St. Gabriel, that are actually linked to out of this site. And it's very easy to sort through if your client has an idea of which culture or time period that they are looking at for naming practices. So I always recommend that a consultation for names start at heraldry.sca.org if the client comes to you without any presuppositions. I mentioned the Academy of St. Gabriel on the last slide. These guys used to be a very active group. You could write into them by email and say, hey, I'm looking for a name in this time period in this country that means dog catcher or that sounds like, Hundenkrieger. What have you got? And this group would go out and they would actually research the names for you, and they would write an essay and then send you back the essay and say, here's what we found, here are some options. And when they did that, they would post their essay on their website. Now, several years ago, they stopped doing individual research for specific clients, but they continue to maintain their website where they have all their archived essays and where they also have links out to various collections of names similar to the links that you can find on the heraldry.sca.org site. So the Academy of St. Gabriel, great place to go. Check it out. They have articles on, for instance, the one you can see here on the screenshot, choosing a medieval name. And unfortunately, again, I can't link out to that site because of the nature of my display here. But if I could scroll down, it actually goes through a little mini tutorial on how to choose a correct medieval name. And you can see what's new. They've listed some of their more recent finds of historical documents or articles written by modern people. For instance, Russian merchants at river ports of the Bay of Bothnia, dated 1548, by Rebecca Lewis, aka Friedra Wolfsdottir. I will tell you, as a submissions deputy, Frida is one of the most outstanding onomastic heralds in the SCA, somebody that I lean on very heavily for um, correcting name submissions that come out of AEthelmearc. And you can see that she's responsible for pretty much the bottom 60% of the articles that are listed on this page. So very, very prolific. If you're interested in Old Norse names, the Viking Answer Lady is a widely accepted source by the College of Arms because, again, she does very, very good research. So www.vikinganswerlady.com. And you can see that not only does it have a list of, oh, good, that one will let me out there. Not only does it have a list of Old Norse men's name, Old Norse women's name, names of Scandinavians in the Byzantine Varangian Guard and in Russia, Old Norse names and gods, bibliography, but these first two articles, Old Norse name construction. So let's say you can't find the actual Norse name that you want, but you can find name elements. So you want to be son of the old black bear, and you can't find the surname son of the old black bear anywhere. You might be able to construct a byname that means something close to son of the old black bear using the lessons in this article on Old Norse name construction. And I'm not certain that's going to open for me right now. But she also has the guide to pronunciation of Old Norse names. So you look here, oh look, the orthographic, A as in date, or A as in weight, A or AI as in fair, hair, E as in Pete, feet, so on and so forth. So she gives you all kinds of clues on how to properly pronounce the Scandinavian names. And you can just go to a list. Look here. She tells you where they come from. Hey, Abe or Abi, short form of Abjorn, found in, and she gives you the source documentation, the actual period source that includes that name, as well as the time period that it was used in. So Viking Answer Lady is widely accepted as a good source, a valid source for Old Norse naming practices. There are some name source books that have been put out online. The real key here is if it is a hard copy book, if it's one of the ones that's what's called the no photocopy list. No photocopy list means that all I have to do is cite the book and page number. I don't actually have to photocopy the pages and send photocopies in, because most of the heralds working in the College of Arms will have a copy of that book available to them. So you say it's Gearbossi page 12. I go downstairs to my library, pull my Gearbossi off of the shelf, open up to page 12, and lo and behold, there's the name. The annotated name book list, if I could scroll down on this page, you would see that there's several resources that are listed there as well. Annotated book lists are pretty decent because the annotations give the dates for the names, so they can be dated in history. And they will also generally tell you if the form of the name is the actual period form or if it's a modern transliteration. But those aside, let's say it's a book that I can't find in the average Herald's library. Google Books um, has loaded up a ton of digitized books and put them out online. And of course, Google Books wants to make a profit. So if you want to purchase the book to read the entire thing, you're going to have to pay. But they will frequently offer, in some cases, between dozens and hundreds of pages of free preview. So you can actually read through some of the book in order to get an idea if you would like to purchase it or not. And in probably 60% of the cases, when I've accessed Google Books free preview, I've found the documentation that I needed for a particular name, and I could just screenshot the Google book and submit that as documentation. There's also a site called archive.org. Archive.org is digitized books as well. They're a service that has set up books that the copyright has expired. So they are public domain books, and Archive offers them up for full download or for reading online. Other places besides archive.org, Gutenberg project.org is another good one where if you know the title of the book, you can go out and find it. Gutenberg also has digitized copies of books that have exceeded their copyright. And if you know the name of the book and you can find it on one of these free sites, you can frequently get the screenshot or the cut and paste of the documentation that you need. Where do you find the list of book titles? Believe it or not, go back to heraldry.sca.org. In either the Standards for Evaluation of Names in Armory or the Administrative Handbook, I don't recall which off the top of my head, there is an appendix of sources that are on the no copy list. There is and a list of books that are considered to be good sources. Pull the title of the book from one of those lists, go search it on one of these sites, and Bob's your uncle. Other places that you can look, and we're back to heraldry.sca.org, lists of names that can actually be submitted without having a book reference for it. One place is go into the online system for commentary and response. And if, for instance, you wanted to register the name Deirdre, but you couldn't find it anywhere, you go into Oscar and you do a search on the name Deirdre, and it's going to look back at all of the letters of intent that included a Deirdre. And you can click open the letter of intent. You can actually see what documentation the previous client used in order to get that name. And you just copy and paste the same documentation. Reusable. You can look through the SCA Ordinary and Armorial, which has a list of every name that's ever been registered in the SCA. I will caveat you on that. As it says here on the screenshot, the fact that a name has been registered previously does not prove that it's authentic. And there are names, particularly from the 1970s and 80s, that were registered that are no longer considered usable in the SCA because of changes in the criteria that we have for registering those names. Middle English Dictionary, great place to go to find the Middle English version. So if you wanted an occupational by name and you didn't want to just be known as the blacksmith, crack open the Middle English Dictionary, look at what they called a blacksmith in
the 14th century and modify it to the appropriate grammar for an occupational surname. Same thing with the Anglo-Norman Dictionary, Dictionary of the Scots language. All of those with the dictionaries, very helpful with occupational bynames or descriptive bynames. Records of the Parliaments of Scotland. The RPS is a good source of names generically. There are quite a few of the names in the RPS that are either undated or where the name that's listed is the modern transliteration. So not every name in the RPS would be automatically accepted in its provided spelling. But it is a great way. I mean, if I pop open the RPS and I find the name Donnell in there, while the spelling might have changed over the years, at least I know that Donnell is a Scottish name with a similar pronunciation that probably existed in the time that's cited. And that goes on the Problem Names Project. MedievalScotland.org is a nonprofit organization that deals with problem names, names that are difficult to find historically, and so on and so forth. But also names and naming practices that have become urban legend. And so it destroys a lot of the myth and urban legend surrounding naming practices. There are dozens more on this site. Highly recommend you go to the Without Books list at heraldry.sca.org. Other online resources, Family Search has become very popular lately. Family Search is owned and operated by the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, and these guys have what is probably one of the finest genealogical libraries in the world. And millions of records have already been digitized. Thousands are being added every year. And it allows you to search on first name, last name, country, birth year, death year, marriage year, date of baptism. You can actually go in here and you can set up different search criteria for what you're looking for, and it will pull up records. Now, there are some caveats with Family Search. Again, just because it pulls up a name with a country and year next to it does not mean that that particular source that it's taken from is considered acceptable by the SCA College of Arms. There are some sources that the sources are primarily batched, and there are some batches that have a designator that indicates that they have been thoroughly researched and vetted by multiple name experts, and therefore they are in this batch, generally designated by the first letter in the batch number. There are other batch numbers where it says, we've reviewed an actual document. It was written kind of messy and a little bit smudged, so we think this is what the name was, but we're not 100% sure. That goes into this other batch. There are some records that are not batched at all, where they just supply you with a JPEG of the microfilm photograph of a document, and you can look at the actual document and you can try to read the handwriting yourself and see if you can make out what the name is. So the batches that have been vetted are generally accepted without too much question. The unvetted batches are generally not accepted unless you have some kind of corroborating evidence. The JPEG unbatched records are accepted on a case-by-case basis because literally when you put that on a letter of intent, a dozen heralds are all going to go look at that JPEG and they're going to argue about what it says. And if there's not a consensus, it's being rejected. But in general, I would say Family Search is a very valuable online resource for locating historical names. Now, Hardcopy Resources, I'm not going to go into the whole list. On the screenshot here, you're only looking at about a quarter of the hard copy books that are recommended by the College of Arms. And you can see this is Appendix H in the Administrative Handbook. And these are just the no photocopy books. So Barlow and Gentry, Bardsley, Bedingfeld, Black, Brault, Breckenmacher, Brooke Little, Bruce Draconarius of Mistime, who happens to be a former Laurel King of Arms, the Pictorial Dictionary of History. That's more on the Armory side. When you get down there, Eckwall, Foster, Gear Bossy, Rainey and Wilson, these are all name books that have been thoroughly vetted over the decades by SCA Heralds and have been determined to be both dated and accurate. And therefore, you cite the title, the edition number, the page number. And I guarantee you, I have about 3/4 of these books in my personal library. If I look in the Kingdom's library, they probably have 90, 95% of these titles. So if you don't have it, contact another Herald or put the word out over the Herald email net, and it's highly likely that somebody has that copy available and can send you the information that you need. Sources to avoid, Administrative Handbook, Appendix F. I don't know if I'll be able to link through to it or not, but let's take a look. Oh, not found on that server. So I need to update my link. But if you go to heraldry.sca.org and you open up the Administrative Handbook and you scroll down to Appendix F, you are going to see a list of books that have been vetted over the decades by numerous heralds with way more knowledge and expertise than I have and found to be total crap. I guarantee you 90% of the books on that list are baby name books. I also guarantee you that 1/3 of your clients are going to show up and say, I really like this name. I found it in a baby name book. So be prepared for that discussion. Baby name books are dartboards for parents. They will tell you, oh, the name means gentle one, blessed by God, lamb of the pasture. It derives from this ancient language that nobody speaks anymore, so on and so forth. Crap. Rumor and hearsay. Worse than a wiki. To be a valid source, the book must be both accurate and dated. Other sources to avoid are scholarly works, actually really well done essay books dealing with naming practices. But in the heart of those books, they will not have included the original historical spellings of any of the names. They will have anglicized or normalized every name. So it might give you the name Aloysius, and it'll tell you actual dated histories of the name Aloysius, where it comes from, where it derives from. That's all documentable, but the period spelling was actually Allosaurus, and that appears nowhere in the book. That book is on the sources to avoid. Other sources to avoid, they do give you all kinds of period spellings, but they don't tell you the date for any of them. So you can't verify that just because they say historical. Remember, to an onomast, historical is anything that happened over 25 years ago. It's generational. So they could very well be giving you all kinds of great historical data about a name that wasn't used until the 1890s. Wendy is a good example. Wendy was a name that was coined by the author of the book Peter Pan. Now there are variations of Wendy, that can be traced back earlier than that. But that actual name was invented in the writing of the book Peter Pan. So sources to avoid, a very good list to be familiar with. Now, when we talk about submitting names, everything's about the form. And there are three reasons why we would fill out a name form, and therefore three variations on the form itself. Individuals are people like you and me who want a personal name for ourselves. Groups are SCA groups, official SCA groups, kingdoms, principalities, baronies, shires, cantons, etc. But unlike Armoury, groups in the SCA that can register a name also include unofficial groups such as guilds and households. But groups have some caveats. For instance, if it's an official group, let's say a new shire starts up, you and 4 of your friends get together, decide to start a shire, and the 5 of you want to name the shire Shire of the Burning Chimney. You do have to include a petition signed by a majority of the populace in that shire in order to submit that name for registration. So if you have 5 people in the shire, 3 of them have to sign the petition saying, yes, that's what we want to call the shire before your name submission will be considered. Same thing with baronies, principalities, kingdoms. Kingdoms gets real tricky because, of course, you got hundreds and hundreds of people all over the place. Households and guilds, they're unofficial. The household name or the guild name will generally be registered to the kingdom, usually associated with some piece of armory, one of the kingdom badges. Households, the household names are generally registered to an individual. So for instance, I have a household registered to me called the Guardians of the Crossroads. And I also have a badge for that household that is registered to me as a personal badge, but in the Armorial and Ordinary, it actually says it's registered to Matic Arundel for the Guardians of the Crossroads. They don't require petitions. The king and queen can register, can submit names of guilds. Anybody can submit the name of a household. But then you also have orders and awards. And orders and awards can only be submitted by baronies and above. And it does require the baron and baroness, prince and princess, king and queen, at whatever level the order or award is being submitted from, to be the actual client in that case. And they all have slightly different information that's going to go onto that name form. Now, I will tell you, the 2 most important parts of this name form are this top half, which includes all of the information that was used in the consultation and all the information that is used to identify the client. And the other most important part is this bottom half, which includes all the documentation for the name elements. Sound confusing? It isn't. The bottom line is, if it's on the form, it's on the form for a reason. Don't leave blank spots on the form. I may not know why they're asking a question. For instance, I don't know why they ask the submitter's date of birth, other than it may be a holdover from when you had to be a certain age in order to register a name. But it's on the form. So I'm going to ask the client, what's your date of birth? And I'm going to write it down on the form. The head matter up here, these little check boxes, very, very important. Is this your primary name or an alternate name or a household name or an order name? Is it new? Is it a resubmission? Did you submit the name previously and it got kicked back? And so this is different, but you don't want to have to pay again. So it's a resubmission. If it was a resubmission, when and where did you submit it the first time? So that we can look it up and find out why it was kicked back and determine if your new submission has fixed the problem. If it's a change of a name, do you want to release your old name or do you want to retain it as an alternate persona, so on and so forth. Check the boxes. I have been contacted by people who say, well, on here it says gender of submitter and it's binary, date of birth. Why do we need that information? I don't know. It's on the form. The DEI officer had asked me if I could actually remove it from the form. Unfortunately, the kingdom doesn't have any control over the content on the forms. The Laurel office is the one that issues the form. The only variations that we're allowed to make on it is we're allowed to put our kingdom name up here in the corner, and we're allowed to mess a little bit with the size of some of the text areas, just for ease of reading, but we can't change the basic format. So if there is something on there which, in this case, gender of submitter, date of birth, that you don't believe to be germane to the submission, feel free to leave those blank. It is very important, though, that these checkboxes on the right-hand side get filled in. It is equally important that the contact information for both the individual and the consulting herald be filled in. I get so many of these that it just has the consulting herald's name. It doesn't have their email or phone number. It'll have the name and the street address of the client, but it won't have the city, state, or zip code. And without a zip code or without an email or a phone number, if there's an issue with the name, I have no way to contact the client. So make sure as much of that information as possible is filled in. We talked about the boxes down here, major and minor changes. There's some additional boxes here. If you're going to allow certain changes, what is most important to you? The meaning of the name, the sound of the name, the spelling of the name, or the time period or culture language of the name. And if you check any of those boxes, there's a little spot here that says, please specify. Don't check meaning and then leave that blank. The meaning of the name is most important to me. Well, what meaning did you want? I don't know. Sound is most important. Well, what do you want it to sound like? I don't know. I didn't put anything. If you check a box, tell me, what meaning do you want? What sound do you want? What spelling do you want? What language do you want? Little checkbox down here. The desired gender of my name. Male, female, don't care. There are people out there, I have a male client with a male persona who really liked a female name. And so I notified him and I said, you realize that in the country and time period that you've chosen for your name, that this name was strictly limited to females. He goes, yeah, I don't care. I like the name. I don't care if the name doesn't match my persona. Okay, cool. We check the box that says don't care. All's good. Things down here, optional. Please change my name to be authentic for. So I can write in there, let's say I've submitted an Irish name that I like, but I want it to be a truly authentic 12th century Irish name. Write 12th century Irish in there. And if you do that, by the way, leave these boxes unchecked, because to make a name authentic, unless you've done a heck of a lot of research, there's probably going to be some changes. And there are, make it authentic for language and culture, make it authentic for time period. But specify which time period and which language or culture you want. This box here is, will you accept a holding name or not? Only needs to be checked if you're submitting Armoury at the same time, and only needs to be checked if you absolutely refuse to accept a holding name. If you want your Armoury kicked back along with your name, go ahead and check that box. Very, very important to get the top half of that done. The bottom here is left blank. That's where you put your documentation. And as a consulting herald, it's very important that you be specific on what you write in there. And it's also very important that your handwriting be readable. I get so many submissions forms where I can't read your handwriting, and I have to call you on the phone or email you to find out what you wrote, and you don't remember because it was a Penzic consultation, or you did it at 12th night and handed the paperwork to the client. The client sat on it for 6 months. Or worse, you didn't give me your email or your phone number. And so I'm looking at it and I'm going, I can make out what looks like a B and then a squiggle, and you're like, yeah, that's Balo. And then I go and it says P, but I can't read the numbers. You go, yeah, it's page 38. Okay, cool. If it's a no copy item, you just put, hey, Balo page 38, Gearbossi page 12, whatever. Got it. It's a no copy. I verify it's there on my edition. Go forward. If you pull it from a website or from a book that requires copies, you have to give me the entire URL and the entry. Because if I go to that URL and it's a list of 4,000 names, I'm not searching through the list for that one name. So, tell me, Oriel, spelled Uhryel, located at this website about 3/4 of the way down the page. Okay, cool. Got it. If it's a book that is not on the no copy list, tell me Oriel from Smith & Wesson, page 46. See attached. Make sure you get the Xerox copy of not just page 46, but also the title and declaration page of the book you took it from. So the title page, the declaration page, which is the copyright page, and the page where the actual name appears. If it just gives me the name and I don't have that book in my library, it's coming back for the client to supply that information. So knock out as much of that as possible. Now, you've got the name, you've got the documentation, you got to check for conflict. Believe it or not, no matter how many John Smiths there are in the United States, you can only have one in the SCA. So there are many different kinds of conflict. The first one is identity conflict. An identity conflict is where two people appear to be the same person. And there's two ways that identity conflict happens. The first is by sound. So John Smith, spelled John Smith, and John Smith, spelled John Smythe, conflict because they both sound like John Smith. The other one is appearance. Let's say that I have two John Smiths, John, but one of them spells their last name Smythe and one spells their name Smythe. They may be both pronounced Smith, they may be both pronounced Smythe. But let's say Smythe is pronounced Smith, Smythe is pronounced Smythe. So John Smith and John Smythe don't sound alike. But there's a single letter difference between the two names. So the name looks like it could be the same name. And therefore, it's a conflict. We have rules in the standards for evaluation of names and armory that dictate how many changes need to occur in a name in order to avoid conflict. And in general, it's 2 changes. You have to have a change of 2 letters, 2 sounds, 2 syllables, etc. In general, it's much more detailed than that. And as I said, I am not an onomast, so I don't do a lot of conflict checking on names. But they're very specific about when, and they give numerous examples where, well, this changed a letter on one side of the vowel. We needed to change 2 letters on one side of the vowel or 1 letter on each side of the vowel to clear conflict. We didn't do that. By the same token, in AEthelmearc here, I have 2 ladies, both registered names. One is Grania Roth, and the other is Grania Ni Roth. The difference between them, Grania Red and Grania Daughter of Red. The addition of a single syllable when that syllable was an article in the name, as opposed to being part of either the given name or the byname. The addition of an article in between the first name and the byname was sufficient to clear conflict. Other types of conflict. I know of 2 individuals with the same first name and the same byname. And what cleared the conflict between them was one of them added a locative. So one of them is Jane Doe, and the other one is Jane Doe of Thescor. The addition of the of Thescor was enough to clear both the sound and appearance conflicts. Now, another relationship conflict, one that implies a close relationship to a registered person, patronymics, son of. It would be very common for somebody to be named James Johnson. And certainly every John registered in the SCA could not claim that that was a relationship conflict simply because they were claiming to be the son of one of the Johns. But if you imply too close a relationship to a registered person, that could be a relationship conflict. So we had a woman who submitted a byname, and her name was first name, wife of husband's first name. So Jane, John's wife. But she didn't want to be just John's wife. She wanted to be a specific John's wife. So she had it as Jane, John Smith's wife. Because John Smith was his registered name, and of course these are fake names, because the husband was registered as John Smith by claiming to be John Smith's wife, she had to have a letter from her husband stating that yes, he was indeed her husband and he gave her permission to conflict with his name in order to register her own. So if you imply too close a relationship to an actual registered person, it will kick back. Now, when you look at the standards for evaluation of names in Armoury, affectionately known as SCA, when we're dealing with people names, we look in section PN3. When we're dealing with other than people names, what's called non-personal names, that would be the names of orders or wards, households, guilds, kingdoms, shires, etc. Those are non-personal names, NPN3. And the personal names section and the non-personal names section, the formats are set up exactly the same. So the same paragraph in PN3 that you would find rules on given names, you will find rules on the first part of non-personal names in that same paragraph in NPN3. How else can I check for conflict? Hey, let's plug the name into Oscar as an actual submission entry in a prototype letter of intent. And when we save the name, Oscar actually reaches out into the ordinary and armorial, and it pulls names that appear to be similar to the name you've just entered. So the example here, I've got Lynn Michinelli, and Oscar said, look, please consider the following possible conflicts. Many of these will not be a conflict. Lennon McNeil, and it's looking for name patterns. So it finds McAnally and McNeil to be a similar pattern. It finds Lennon to be a similar pattern to Lynn. So it's highlighted that name. Lonan O'Connell. O'Connell as opposed to McGinelli. I would actually pronounce that Michinelli, but I'm not an onomast. So it identified a couple of ones I can look at, and right off the bat I can say, no, I've changed at least 2 sounds and at least 2 syllables in each of those names. Neither one of those is a conflict. You'll also notice this is where the head matter goes that you entered in the top half of that name form. Culture, keep first name Lynn most important. Now, that's not actually cultural, but they checked a box that said something is very important to me. They probably should have checked the spelling box or the pronunciation box and said first name Lynn is most important. But at least it tells me what they find most important. Here's the documentation. Lynn is found in family search records as a feminine given name. Gray period is 1600 to 1650. Lynn Langen Mariage, 28 July 1619 in Katholisch, Neukirch, Rhineland, Prussia, and then the batch number. M94004-6 is the batch number. And because it's an M batch, because it's an M9 batch, it's probably acceptable. The link directly to that item in the batch so that anyone can click on that link and look at it. And then also included with the submission is a copy of the driver's license that shows that Lynn is her mundane given name, middle name, and that it was attested to by the submissions herald in the kingdom in which this was submitted. That's called the legal name allowance. And it allows you to use one part of your modern legal name as part of your SCA name, even if it breaks one of the other rules on name combinations. And then Michinelli, Italian family name, dated to the late 15th and 16th century, found in name of the article, by name of the author, link to the article. All of that information is what was included on the name submission form. So how does Oscar find those name patterns? Using a couple of search forms. So if we crack open the ordinary and armorial at O&A at SCA.org, we find that there are search forms, and there's a number of them here. You can see different ones for names and Armoury. I have chosen the name pattern search form. And here's what's cool. There's a hints page, and it tells me how I can use patterns in names in order to find other names that might conflict. So I can just type in, I can literally just type in the name. I can type in MADOC, and it's going to call up 84 items that have MADOC as a name element. And you'll notice that most of them are surnames. There's a barony name, shire name, which became the barony. When we get down to first names, oh, look at that. There's me, Maddock Arundel. There's a Maddock Hawthorne Sinclair, Maddock Kenneth, Maddock McBrand, Maddock Muir, Maddock With, Maddock up Llewellyn, Maddock up Morrig. And these are just the Maddocks with MADOC as a pattern. Maddock Grayson, Maddock de Messina. It's not finding the Maddox spelled with 2 Ds. So under the hints page, there are codes in here that I can add, like the $sign. I can add a $sign after the pattern saying that I only want the name if it appears at the beginning of a name string. I only want the name pattern that I've typed in if it appears at the end of a name string. I can use wildcards. I can tell it I want a very narrow search meaning I want it to find the exact spelling, or I can tell it I want a very broad search, telling it look for any spelling that has a similar pronunciation. So by typing in the names, I can look to see if a name pattern that I am looking at might be in conflict with a name that is already registered. And that's the same algorithm that the Oscar program uses for the determination of those, hey, double check these names. Now, how do we clear conflict? Well, we can add or remove a syllable. As I said, I've got a Granuroth and a Granudiroth. By the addition of that article, I have cleared the conflict between the two names. I can add or remove a middle name. So the difference between John Doe and John Allen Doe is the middle name. There are some languages that allow you to have two given names. There are some languages and cultures that allow you to have two by names. So I could be John, son of John, the blacksmith, John Johnson Smith, so on and so forth. So adding or removing a middle name element. We talked about adding the locative, occupational, or descriptive element. So the difference between Jane Doe and Jane Doe of Thescore was the locative of Thescore. The difference between John Smith and John Smith the Red is that John Smith the Red is the red-haired John Smith, the addition of the descriptive element. Changing the language. This one is tricky. Because in SCA terms, it's only been very recently that we have not worried about translations of the names. But with certain changes, it is actually permissible to register a John Smith and a Johann Schmidt, because we've changed the spelling, appearance, and sound of both elements of the name. Even though Johann Schmidt translates into the English John Smith, they are no longer considered the same name in SCA heraldry. So changing the name from English to German, German to Norse, French to Italian, or changing the language of one element where the two languages in the name are compatible according to our compatible language listing, can also help clear that conflict. Variant form of the given name or surname. Again, a relatively recent change in SCA naming practices. It used to be that a diminutive of a given name conflicted with the given name. So for example, you have the name Robert. Diminutives of Robert include Rob, Robin, Bob, Bert, and Bertie. If any of those diminutive names can be documented as a given name in their own right, they are not considered to be in conflict with Robert. So Robin, in particular, Robin can be documented as a given name in its own right. So even though it was a diminutive of Robert in period, because I can find it in its own right, I can register it without conflicting with the other Roberts out there. So the variant form of the given name, Robert John Johnson versus Robin Johnson, may clear the conflict. Again, I would have to double check the total number of syllables or letters that have to be changed to clear that. So variant forms might clear the conflict. Things to double check. You're at the end of your consultation. Your client's happy. You haven't found any obvious conflicts. Some administrative issues. A few of these we've already talked about, so I'll just go over them real quick. Missing information on the forms. Fill in as much of that information as you possibly can. Make it as legible as you possibly can. Using an outdated form. The College of Arms updates the forms every so many years. It's not a set schedule. If they change something, they put out a new version of the form, and they give a certain time period when the old version will still be accepted. But after that time period expires, submitting on an outdated form will result in the submission being rejected. And as I understand it, that has something to do with the OCR readers that they use to scan the forms into the electronic databases. If you're submitting a group submission, a new shire name or barony name, for example, and you fail to include the populous petition, that is grounds for return. If you're missing a payment, you send in the submission form, but you don't send in the check, or you send in the check for the wrong amount. Or another issue used to be that consulting heralds could take cash from the client, deposit the cash in the shire account, and then write a shire check for the submission. We're not allowed to do that anymore due to changes in the rules of the Exchequer's office. But we're also concerned with the possibility that people could register a name for somebody else without that other person's permission. So the person writing the check and the person submitting the form need to be the same person, or at least a close relative like spouse or child of the person writing the check in order for that submission to be accepted. So the payments need to match the amount due. The payment needs to be included, and the check needs to be written by the client. And then we talked about boxes checked without explanation. If you check that sound is important, or culture is important, or language is important, make sure you tell me what sound you're looking for, what language you're looking for, so on and so forth. Don't leave me hanging. I've had name submissions come in with zero documentation. I've had name submissions come in where the documentation has said "see attached" and there's nothing attached. I've had documentation that actually came in. We have an individual who is the foremost authority on Japanese names, historical Japanese names for SCA purposes. Her name is Solveig. And I had a name documentation sheet come in one time that said Solveig has the documentation. And I contacted the client and I said, did you get the documentation from Solveig? And they said, oh no, we thought we just wrote her name on the sheet and you contacted her. And it turns out that the client never actually talked to Solveig. The client went off the consulting herald's statement that don't worry about that, I will talk to Solveig. So the consulting herald talked to Solveig, but did not include the information on the submission. And it took about 2 months to run down the information that Solveig subsequently provided to get that put in. Documentation does not match submission. I have received a submission where the name submitted was a Norse name and the documentation was for a German name. And worse, they weren't even close in pronunciation or appearance. Turns out the consulting herald had mixed up the papers and sent the wrong attachments in the envelope. So make sure the documentation matches the submission. Documentation is missing scanned pages or web URLs. If it's not on the no copy list, I have to have the title page, the declaration page, and the page that the name appears on. And I need to have photographs or scans that are legible. If it's a web source, I need to have the full URL and some idea of where it appears on that website. Last but not least, cited documentation does not include the name element it is cited against. I've had people that said Academy of St. Gabriel cited Brian, B-R-I-A-N. And when I look at the name element that it was cited against, it was Brian, B-R-E-Y-A-N. So the spelling was completely different even though it was Brian, and the spelling was completely different from the name that was being submitted. So if the documentation does not match the name that it's cited against, it's not valid documentation. Style issues, you want to double check. Make sure that the constructed name grammar is correct. This one's not real vital if your client allows changes, because we have experts somewhere in the SCA in probably 90% of the languages in common use. And during commentary, those experts are going to chime in with the correct grammar. And if they make changes, they're going to run it past the client before they register it anyway. So that's not as important. If it's obtrusively modern, we are not going to register Clark Kent as an SCA name, even though both Clark and Kent are documentable in period. We are not going to register Richard Nixon, even though both names are documentable in period, because it's obtrusively modern. It cannot be an offensive name. We will not register the name Hitler, even though it is documentable in period. We might register the name Bite Me, but we probably won't register the name Eat Me, even if both elements are documented in period. If it's overly fantasy or sci-fi-ish, early in the SCA, it was very, very common for people to pick names like Marguerite of the Rainbow Clouds, or Sherry Lynn of the Golden Woods. And even in modern times, it's not uncommon for somebody to pluck a favorite character out of science fiction and try to find an SCA compatible name that kind of sounds like the famous character. So I might be able to document the name Green, the name Lant, and the name Turn, but putting them together as Green Lantern is going to be overly sci-fi-ish. And most of those names that are fantasy sci-fi will get kicked back. The last style issue, presumption. Names like Rex, while a given name in the modern era, even if it's your mundane legal name, probably not allowed because it's Latin for king. Same with the name Earl. If the name is presumptuous, it's probably going to get kicked back. If it's claiming supernatural powers, if you're trying to name yourself, son of Jesus Christ, or you're trying to name yourself an office, an official office of a city. So if you were to name yourself John, the dog catcher of Moorfelden, as opposed to John of Moorfelden, the dog catcher, you cannot give yourself a name that implies that you are holding an official office of some kind. So any name, double check the name for presumption as well. That about concludes my knowledge of consulting on SCA names. I would encourage you to check out the companion videos where I talk heavily about Armoury Consultation. I also I have a separate video that deals with how the Garnet office handles a submission once the client or the consulting herald forwards that submission in, what happens to it after it leaves your hands. And another video that is still in the works where I discuss writing valid commentary as a commenting herald on letters of intent put out by the College of Arms. So please check out those videos as well. And I hope to see you at an event someday.